Chapter 1. The Waking. The first sign that King Edward Volkov's brain had been rearranged like furniture in a room no one had consulted him about was not the doctor's grim face, nor the way Beta Marcus Vance was gripping the edge of a chair as though it had personally wronged him. It was the way Edward looked at the woman standing at the foot of his bed. She was tall. Not imposingly so, but in the way that suggested she had spent a lifetime refusing to make herself smaller for anyone's convenience. Hair the color of warm honey, swept back with the kind of effortless precision that he suspected was actually very effortful. Eyes that held something old and quiet and vast, like a library that went deeper than you expected. And his entire body was on fire. Not the painful kind. The kind that made his teeth ache and his hands shake and every single cell orient toward her like iron filings to a magnet. Something inside him, something that did not deal in subtlety or half measures or indoor voices, was making its position extremely clear. That one. Her. The one with the eyes. Why is she all the way over there? That is too far. Everything about that distance is wrong. Fix it. Fix it now. Use the legs. Edward gripped the bedsheets. His knuckles went white. He turned to Marcus, who was watching him with the expression of a man bracing for an explosion in a room full of very expensive things. "Marcus," he said, and his voice came out approximately 2 octaves lower than intended. "Who is that?" Marcus closed his eyes, opened them, closed them again. The second closing lasted longer, as though he were petitioning a higher power for strength, or perhaps for a different career. "That is Queen Ruth, Your Majesty," Marcus said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man delivering news he already knew would be received poorly. "Your wife." Edward's head swiveled back to her so fast his neck cracked. "My wife? We have a wife? We have a wife and no one led with this? This is the most important piece of information in the entire kingdom, and it was behind the trade briefing and the border report? Marcus has failed us. Also, we forgive him, because look at her. Look. She smells like old books and something sweet, and the concept of coming home after a very long time away. You've been married for 5 years, sire," Marcus continued, with the energy of a man reading his own obituary aloud. "The healer believes the concussion has resulted in—" "5 years?" Edward whispered, not hearing a word Marcus was saying. He was too busy staring at Ruth, who was standing perfectly still, her expression a masterwork of royal composure. Unreadable, beautiful, slightly terrifying. He had been married to this woman for 5 years? 5 years, and the sight of her was making something inside him do things that felt structurally unsafe. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence because every possible ending seemed laughably insufficient. Ruth watched all of this from the foot of the bed, with the practiced stillness she had perfected over 5 years of diplomatic functions, tedious state dinners, and one marriage that had taught her the fine art of feeling nothing visible. Inside, she was not still at all. Something in her, the part that noticed everything, that catalogued micro-expressions the way other people catalogued weather, had registered a series of facts in rapid succession. His pupils, dilated. His breathing, elevated. His scent, flooded with something warm and desperate and unmistakable. His hands, trembling, not from the injury, from her. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her exactly once before. 5 years ago. At a state function in her father's territory, when a young prince had walked into a room full of political calculations and seen a woman reading a treaty in the corner and promptly forgotten how legs worked. He'd tried to bow and shake her hand at the same time and ended up in something that could only be described as a curtsy. She'd laughed so hard she'd had to leave the room. She'd been halfway to falling for him before he'd gotten his name out. That man had been gone for a long time, 2 years at least, maybe longer, if she was honest about the slow fade, the gradual replacement of warmth with duty, of Edward with Your Majesty, of partnership with coexistence. It hadn't happened overnight. It had happened the way shorelines erode. So slowly you don't notice until you look up and the land you were standing on is gone. She knew why. She'd always known why, even when she was too proud to say it aloud. His father. King Aldric's decline had been the ugliest thing she'd ever witnessed. A degenerative condition that had stripped an alpha king of his faculties over 18 months while the entire pack watched. Aldric, who had been formidable and brilliant, reduced to a man who couldn't remember his own beta's name. And worse, far worse, the mate bond had carried every moment of it to Edward's mother, Helena. Ruth had watched Helena become a ghost, hollowed out by the shared experience of her mate's disintegration, unable to look away because the bond wouldn't let her. Helena had survived Aldric by 4 months. The healers said it was her heart. Ruth knew it was the bond. Edward had inherited the crown from a dying man and buried both parents within a year. And somewhere in that crucible, he had made a decision. Not consciously, not as a philosophy, but as scar tissue, that the crown was a thing that consumed, and the people closest to it got consumed first. And the only way to protect the people he loved was to not let them get close enough to be burned. He had never said any of this. That was the cruelest part. He'd just pulled away. Inch by inch, meeting by meeting, dinner by dinner, until the man who had curtsied at her was buried under the king, and the king kept his queen at the same polite distance he kept his council, close enough for function, far enough for safety. And Ruth, whose defense mechanism was composure, whose instinct when hurt was to become more perfect, more controlled, more impenetrably queen, had matched him. Wall for wall, formality for formality. He stopped reaching, she stopped reaching. He went cold, she went colder. 2 people in a standoff, both waiting for the other to break first. Neither of them did. The royal healer had been clear. 4 years of memory, gone. His last clear memory was approximately a month before the engagement, before his father's decline began. He remembered agreeing to the political match. He remembered duty. He did not remember watching his father die. He did not remember the scar tissue. He did not remember learning to be afraid of love. Which meant the man in that bed, the man whose face was turning pink, was Edward before the grief, before the walls, before the lesson that had taught him to keep everyone at arm's length. This wasn't a personality transplant. This was an archaeological excavation. The amnesia hadn't created a new man, it had uncovered the original one. The speech about their separation was folded in the pocket of her dress. 7 drafts. She hadn't been able to finish any of them. She could tell him now. She could say, "You are my husband. Our marriage is a hollow thing. I was leaving you." Or she could not. Deception by omission. Emotional risk, catastrophic. Probability of this ending well, approximately 6%. Proceeding anyway, confirmed. We are an archivist. We have devoted our life to the preservation of truth. We are about to commit the most significant act of selective curation in our career. The irony is noted. "I am pleased to see you are recovering, Your Majesty," she said, and her voice was the smooth, polished instrument that gave away nothing. Edward's mouth opened, closed, opened again. The most powerful alpha in 4 territories was doing an impression of a fish confronted with advanced philosophy. She called us Majesty. We have a title and a mate, and the title is less important, but also very impressive. Quick, say something worthy of her. Something regal and charming and... "You," he managed. Stopped. Tried again. The thing is, Marcus put his face in his hands. Thank you, Edward finally got out, his cheeks a shade of pink that had absolutely no business being on the face of a reigning Alpha King. You're also, Majesty. You're also, Majesty. Ruth pressed her lips together so hard her jaw ached. She was not going to laugh. She was a queen. Queens did not laugh at their amnesiac husband's inability to form basic sentences. Queens maintained composure and dignity and, "You're also, Majesty." She was going to die. She was going to die right here in this room because the most powerful man on the continent had just addressed her like a malfunctioning telegram, and somewhere underneath the composure and the grief and the 2 years of carefully maintained emotional permafrost, something was cracking. And if she didn't leave this room immediately, it was going to crack where people could see it. "If you'll excuse me," she said, her voice only barely controlled, "I will inform the household of your recovery." She turned and walked out with the measured pace of a woman who was absolutely not fleeing. She made it to the hallway, around the corner, back against the cold stone wall, both hands over her mouth. The laugh came out broken and strange and dangerously close to a sob, and she couldn't tell where the humor ended and the grief began, and it didn't matter because, "You're also, Majesty," and this man, this ridiculous, impossible, infuriating man, had been in there this whole time, buried under the grief she understood and the walls she'd helped build, and she was in so much trouble. The memory inventory happened the next morning. Edward, it turned out, remembered everything about being a king. Trade routes, treaty clauses, military deployments, all intact. He could recite the Stone Creek Pact from memory. He knew the treasury, the borders, the guard rotation. What he couldn't remember was anything personal. "Your father," Marcus said carefully, watching Edward's face. "King Aldrich. What do you recall?" Edward frowned. "He's—" A pause. Something flickered across his face, a shadow he couldn't place. "He's dead. I know that. I feel that. But I can't—" He trailed off, looking frustrated. "It's like knowing a fact without having been there. I know he died. I don't remember it." The healer, standing quietly by the window, nodded. Traumatic memories are often the most vulnerable to this kind of injury. The mind protects itself by releasing the heaviest things first. Edward stared at his hands. He looked lost in a way that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with being a man sitting in a gap where grief should be, knowing something terrible lived there, but unable to find it. We are sad about something we can't see. This is very confusing. But the mate smelled like home, and that part isn't confusing at all. Can we focus on the not confusing part? "And my wife," Edward said. "Ruth. What is her favorite color?" Marcus blinked. I'm not certain, sire." "What does she eat for breakfast?" "Toast, I believe, with— What makes her laugh?" The question landed differently. Marcus's expression shifted into something complicated, not evasion, but the careful look of a man realizing he didn't fully know the answer. She used to laugh a lot, sire, in the early days. She has a dry humor. She's very quick." "Used to," Edward repeated, and the past tense sat between them like a stone. "It is a good color, whatever it is. We will find out. We will find out everything. We have time. We have so much time because she is our wife, and we live in the same castle, and this is the greatest strategic advantage in courtship history." Marcus, reporting all of this to Ruth later, paused at her study door. "He asked about you," he said. "Not the queen, you. What you liked, what you read." He hesitated. "He hasn't asked about his father's death once." Only about you." Ruth said nothing for a long time. Then, "The healer says the personal memories are the ones most affected." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Including the trauma." "Yes." She understood what that meant. The distance between them had grown in the shadow of Aldrich's death. If Edward couldn't remember the death, he couldn't remember the lesson it had taught him. He couldn't remember learning to be afraid. He was operating without the scar tissue, without the walls. He was the man from before the grief, and that man had never learned to keep his distance from the people he loved. That man had curtsied at her in a crowded room and looked at her like she'd rearranged the stars. She put the separation speech in her desk drawer, not thrown away, just set aside, for now. Observation. We are making a series of decisions that future us will regard with significant disapproval. Current us is aware of this and is proceeding anyway. The file on this situation is getting very thick. Chapter 2. The Courtship. The courtship began with the walls. He ambushed her in the east corridor on the second day. She was walking to the archives, a stack of manuscripts balanced in her arms, and he materialized from around a corner with the subtlety of a man who had definitely been lurking behind a suit of armor for an indeterminate and probably embarrassing amount of time. She stopped. He stopped. They looked at each other. 12 seconds passed. She counted. 12 seconds of a man staring at his own wife with the desperate intensity of someone trying to remember a word in a language they've forgotten, knowing the word is important, knowing it might be the most important word, and coming up completely empty. "Good walls," he said, and gestured vaguely at the stonework surrounding them. Then he turned and walked away at a pace that was absolutely, unmistakably fleeing. Ruth stood in the corridor, holding her manuscripts, and stared at the space he had just vacated. Good walls. The Alpha King of 4 territories had complemented the structural integrity of a corridor as a conversational opening to his own wife in his own castle. Social interaction attempt 1. Category, architectural. Duration, 12 seconds of silence followed by a masonry review. The subject appeared to have prepared remarks which were abandoned upon visual contact with our face. Replacement material was sourced from the immediate environment. Assessment. This is the man we married. This is the man we loved. He is complimenting walls at us. We should be appalled. We are not appalled. We are holding manuscripts very tightly and our heart rate is elevated. This is clinically fascinating and personally devastating. The second attempt was in the gardens the following afternoon. She was reading on a bench near the rose beds when she felt him approaching, a warm pressure at the edge of her senses, his scent arriving before his footsteps. Pine, ozone, and something underneath that her body recognized before her brain could name it. He had a sentence prepared. She could tell because his lips were moving as he approached, rehearsing. The effect was somewhere between endearing and clinically concerning. He stopped 5 feet away. He opened his mouth, and then his body betrayed him. The instinct to get closer, to close the gap, to breathe her in overrode everything. And instead of the sentence, what came out was a deep, involuntary inhale through the nose that was, objectively, the loudest sniffing sound she had ever heard outside of a veterinary office. She raised one eyebrow. His face did something extraordinary, a journey from hopeful to horrified to resigned that covered approximately 19 distinct emotions in under a second. She returned to her book. He retreated. Interaction attempt 2. Category, olfactory. Duration, 4 seconds before nasal catastrophe. The subject's wolf instincts are overriding his verbal capabilities at the precise moment verbal capabilities are most needed. In layman's terms, the filter is gone and everything is coming through at full volume. In even simpler terms, this enormous, powerful man just sniffed at us from 5 feet away like a golden retriever, and we are experiencing emotions that are incompatible with our dignity. The third attempt was near the kitchens. She was returning a tea tray. She always returned her own trays, a habit the kitchen staff found charming and quietly baffling in a queen. When he appeared in the doorway with the energy of a man who had been tracking her by scent through the castle and was trying very hard to pretend he hadn't. "Do you like bread?" he asked. The question arrived without context, without preamble, and without any visible connection to a larger conversational strategy. It existed in a vacuum, hovering in the warm, yeast-scented air, naked and alone and profoundly inadequate. Ruth considered the question with the same seriousness she brought to treaty negotiations. "I find it a foundational staple, Your Majesty." He nodded slowly, as though she had said something profound. "That's good. Bread it's foundational. You're right. About the bread." She swept past him. As she walked away, she heard him whisper to himself, "Bread is foundational. You said bread is foundational to the most extraordinary woman alive. Add it to the list, right under good walls." Interaction Attempt 3. Category: carbohydrate-based. The subject has now attempted to court us using masonry, respiration, and baked goods. If we plot these on a graph, there is no discernible trend line. There is no strategy. There is only a man who loses the ability to form sentences when we are in the room. And something inside us finds this unbearably, infuriatingly, inconveniently wonderful. This situation has deteriorated beyond projected parameters. We are compromised. She realized, smiling, in the corridor, alone, like someone who had received good news instead of a non sequitur about bread from a man who'd forgotten her existence. She stopped smiling immediately. She was a professional. It was on the 4th day that the gifts began. She was in the Whispering Archives, the deep section, where history wasn't stored in books but in the air itself. Swirling currents of sound preserved by the ancient stones, audible only to a trained mind, when she felt him at the entrance. He was standing there, looking terrified, holding a small bouquet of daisies. They were squashed. Dirt clung to the roots. Several stems were broken at angles, suggesting they had been extracted from the royal flower beds with more enthusiasm than technique. One of them appeared to have been partially eaten, possibly by him during the extraction process, possibly by a passing insect. It was hard to tell. He walked toward her with the solemnity of a man approaching an altar. He held them out. "I noticed the gardens," he said, his voice cracking, "and I thought you might like some of them. Indoors. Brought to you. By me." She looked at the daisies. She looked at his face, the earnestness, the hope, the absolute catastrophic vulnerability of a man presenting stolen weeds to a woman he couldn't remember but couldn't stop wanting to be near. On their first anniversary, he had given her a flawless arrangement of black orchids so rare they were almost priceless. He had handed them to her with a stiff bow. "Happy anniversary, my queen." By then the walls were already going up. Aldrich had been dead for 8 months, and Edward was drowning in the crown and had already started swimming away from her to keep from pulling her under. The orchids were beautiful and perfect and purchased by a secretary and said nothing except I remembered the calendar date and delegated appropriately. These dirt-clumped daisies had more of him in them than anything he'd given her in years. She took the flowers. Her fingers brushed his. She felt it. A jolt, a current that went through him so hard his eyes flashed gold for a full second, the wolf surging into his irises. His hand trembled. A low rumble started in his chest, not a growl, not a purr, something between the two that he probably didn't know he was making, but that she could feel in her sternum from a foot away. Contact. We touched her hand. Her hand is warm and small and perfect, and she took the flowers. She took the flowers we brought. We are the greatest gift giver in the history of courtship. Tomorrow we find her something better, something shiny, something that communicates the full depth of our devotion, which is currently approximately the depth of the ocean. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said, and her voice was softer than she meant it to be. "They're lovely." His face, the look on his face, like she had given him a kingdom, like "they're lovely" was the finest piece of rhetoric ever composed in any language. She put the daisies in a glass of water in her study. She did not tell anyone about the way his eyes had gone gold. She did not tell anyone about the trembling. She pressed her fingers against her own wrist, pulse elevated, skin warm, and filed the data without commentary. This was a terrible idea. She was a terrible person. She was a terrible person who was keeping stolen daisies in a water glass, and falling for a version of her husband that existed because his brain had mercifully deleted the worst 2 years of his life, which were also, not coincidentally, the worst 2 years of hers. We are in significant trouble. We are aware. We are filing this under catastrophic and ongoing. The file is getting very thick. We may need a second file. Chapter 3. The Escalation. The shiny rock appeared 2 days later, a piece of quartz from the riverbed, worn smooth, flecked with mica that caught the light. He'd placed it on her desk in the archives while she was away, right next to a 300-year-old treaty she was translating. It sat there, glinting, profoundly out of place among the ancient manuscripts, like a love note left at a crime scene. When she found it, she picked it up and turned it in her fingers. It was warm. He'd carried it in his pocket. He'd kept a rock warm for her. She put it in her own pocket. Item 2. Mineral offering. Common among certain avian species and some primates. The subject has identified a shiny object and concluded that we should have it. This is not sophisticated reasoning. This is not a strategy. This is a man whose wolf has the romantic instincts of a magpie and the emotional subtlety of a landslide. And we are carrying a rock in our pocket now. We are an archivist, a scholar, a queen. We are carrying a rock in our pocket because a man who cannot remember our middle name thought it was shiny and wanted us to have it. We need to have a serious conversation with ourselves about our standards. Later. We are busy holding the rock. The gifts escalated. A perfectly sharpened quill appeared on her desk. Its feather dyed the exact shade of royal blue she favored, the kind that was notoriously difficult to cut correctly. He must have spent hours. The nib was slightly uneven, suggesting he'd done it himself instead of asking the castle scribe, which meant he'd sat somewhere in the castle with a penknife and a determined expression, and probably several failed attempts, and quite possibly a minor injury, crafting a quill for a woman he couldn't talk to without referencing bread. Then a first edition copy of the Ballads of Sorin the Voiceless, a poetry collection so obscure she was fairly certain only she and 2 long-dead scribes had ever heard of it. He'd ransacked the royal treasury's rare book collection to find it. Marcus reported that the king had spent 3 hours in the archives of the treasury. 3 hours looking for a book she'd mentioned once, in passing, during a dinner conversation he apparently had been listening to, despite all visual evidence to the contrary. 3 hours for a book no one had heard of. Because he was listening. The realization that he had always been listening, even when he was drowning, even when the walls were going up. That was the thing that made her have to sit down in the archives and press her hands against her eyes for a very long time. Anya, her lady-in-waiting, missed none of this. "He's evolving," she observed, watching Ruth trace the leather binding of the ancient book with fingers that were not entirely steady. Started with vegetation, progressed to minerals, detoured through artisanal craftsmanship, and has now reached literature. If this follows the standard trajectory, weaponry is next. He has amnesia, Anya. And you have a rock in your pocket. We've all made our choices. The weaponry arrived, on schedule, the following week. She walked into her study and found a ceremonial dagger on her blotter. Exquisitely crafted, silver filigree inlaid in the hilt, also definitely the property of Lord Ellington, senior council member, who was supposed to wear it at all formal pack functions, and who was, in all likelihood, currently discovering its absence with significant distress. Courtship escalation, weaponry phase. The alpha has progressed from flora to mineral to literary to armed larceny. The trajectory now includes a felony. We should be categorically, unambiguously appalled. We should report this to the appropriate authorities. Except the appropriate authority is the man who committed the crime. We are holding this dagger, and our heart rate is elevated. This is not appalled. This is the diametric opposite of appalled. This is a queen holding a stolen weapon and feeling things that would scandalize the archives. She found him in the corridor outside the archives, his permanent surveillance post, the masonry that apparently required daily royal inspection. He saw her coming. He saw the dagger. His face broke into a grin of such pure, radiant, self-congratulatory delight that she almost dropped the knife. "Do you like it?" he asked, practically vibrating. "I saw Ellington polishing it and I thought, she needs something sharp. Because she is sharp. Her mind is sharp. So she should have a sharp thing. It made complete sense at the time." It still makes sense. She is the most precise, most brilliant, most terrifyingly competent person we have ever met. She deserves an excellent blade. We are an excellent provider. We have provided a blade. This is peak courtship. We should be studied by scholars. "Edward," she said, and her voice was a strangled thing, caught between outrage and something dangerously close to delight. "You cannot steal from council members." "I didn't steal it," he said, looking offended. "I won it." Arm wrestling. He was surprisingly strong for a man who looks like a walrus having a difficult day. But I was motivated. I let him keep his dignity. And his wallet. I just took the knife. He looked so pleased, so catastrophically, incandescently, bone-deep pleased with himself. The king who had once approved the annual budget with the emotional range of a filing cabinet was now standing in a hallway, vibrating with pride because he'd won a knife for her in arm-to-arm combat with an elderly lord who resembled a marine mammal. The laugh came up from somewhere she'd forgotten existed. Deep, unfamiliar, rusty, like machinery that hadn't turned in years, grinding back to life with a sound that hurt and healed in the same breath. It was real and strange and too loud for a queen, and she couldn't stop it. It startled them both. Edward stared at her, and the proud, boyish grin softened into something else, something quieter, infinitely more dangerous. He looked at her the way people look at something they've been searching for without knowing they were searching. "There," he breathed. "That's the sound Marcus told me about." The laughter died in her throat. The silence it left behind was warm and alive and terrifying. He had been trying to make her laugh. Every gift, every awkward conversation, every terrible, fumbling attempt. Not courting her with objects, trying to find his way back to a sound he couldn't remember hearing. The hallway was very quiet. In the old stonework, the glimmer moss, a living remnant of the castle's ancient foundations, responsive to strong emotion the way deep-sea creatures respond to light, began to pulse with a faint green luminescence. Neither of them noticed. "Edward," she said. First time she'd used his name in 2 years. It had always been Your Majesty. The name felt strange and right and painful, like pressing on a bruise to see if it was still there. It was still there. His eyes went gold, not a flash, a slow, steady burn. His whole body changed, the angle of his shoulders, the slight drop of his chin, a low rumble building in his chest that he didn't know he was making, but that she could feel in her sternum. She was close enough to feel the heat radiating off him, not normal body heat, concentrated, directional, aimed at her like a beam. Warning: proximity approaching threshold beyond which rational thought degrades significantly. His scent, pine and ozone and want, and underneath, something that has been ours since before we had a name for it. Heart rate synchronized, pupil dilation, mutual. Distance, 18 inches and closing. We are the one holding all the information. We know the truth he doesn't. Closing the gap now would be taking something he cannot fully offer because he does not have all the facts. It would be taking advantage. Step back. Step back now. She stepped back. It cost her more than she would ever admit. Lord Ellington will want his dagger returned, she said, and her voice was almost steady. He blinked. The gold receded. He looked dazed, like a man surfacing from deep water. Right, he said. The dagger, I'll handle that. She turned and walked away. The glimmer moss pulsed once, brightly, and faded. In her pocket, her fingers closed around the quartz rock. It was warm. Chapter 4. The Poetry. He started writing her poetry. This was, by any objective measure, an act of aggression against the written word. He left the scrolls on her pillow, tied with ribbon. She found them at night, after dismissing Anya, and read them in the privacy of her rooms with an expression that cycled through horror, delight, despair, and something too tender to name. Her eyes, like pools of learning, deep and vast, where ancient treaties and old laws are cast. Her hair, a sheaf of well-organized wheat. My wolf doth think she's rather neat. Review. Meter, inconsistent. Rhyme scheme, present, regrettably. The wheat simile is agriculturally defensible, but romantically inadvisable. The closing line constitutes an understatement of such magnitude it may actually curve back around into sincerity. Overall literary assessment, D-. Overall emotional assessment, we are holding this poem against our chest. We are holding a D- poem against our chest, and our eyes are not dry. This is the most embarrassing thing that has ever happened to us in a career that includes the time we accidentally addressed the Stone Creek Alpha by his ex-wife's name. She kept every one. She kept them in the same drawer where she'd put the separation speech, and she was fully aware of the irony. The death certificate and the love letters, side by side. And she was the only person alive who knew both existed. She was falling in love with him again. A different kind of love this time. The first love had been starstruck, a breathless affection for the charming prince who had curtsied at her and looked at her like she'd rearranged the constellations. A love that had been easy and bright, and hadn't yet learned that easy things could die of neglect. This love was quieter, an ache in a deeper register. It was love for the flawed, fumbling, earnest man underneath the crown. The man who stole knives and wrote bad poetry because he didn't have better words for what he felt. The man whose grief had driven him underground and whose amnesia had accidentally set him free. She loved this man more. And she was terrified because she understood the mechanism now. The charm, the openness, the frantic gift-giving. This wasn't a new Edward. This was the original Edward, operating without the trauma that had taught him to wall himself off, without the memory of his father's decline. without the scar tissue that said, "Love is the thing the crown uses to destroy you." When his memory came back, and it would come back, the walls would come back with it. Conflict analysis. Subject's affection is increasing in direct proportion to subject's awareness of the approaching catastrophe. We are standing in a burning building because the fire is warm. We are aware of the fire. We are aware of the warmth. We are making no move toward the exit. This is the least rational thing we have ever done, and we once devoted 3 years to translating a treaty that turned out to be a 700-year-old grocery list. Filing under human, under wolf, under both, under help. Chapter 5. The Sister. Nora arrived on a Tuesday, unannounced, carrying one bag and an expression that suggested someone was about to get a lecture. Ruth's younger sister was everything Ruth was not, externally. Where Ruth was composed, Nora was kinetic. Where Ruth measured her words like rare metals, Nora spent hers like loose change, freely, abundantly, and in denominations that occasionally made people choke on their tea. "You look terrible," Nora said, pulling Ruth into a hug that lasted 3 seconds longer than protocol allowed. "You look like a woman who hasn't slept properly in a month and is pretending that's fine." "It's been a complicated month." "Is he all right?" The message was vague and I've been imagining the worst. "He's physically fine. His memory is selective." Nora studied her with the particular intensity of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to read Ruth's blueprints, the careful architecture of composure that most people mistook for calm. "How selective?" "He doesn't remember me, or the marriage, or his father's death." She paused. "He remembers how to run a kingdom. He doesn't remember how to talk to his wife." He tried to compliment the walls. He complimented the walls. The masonry, in the East Corridor. He said, "Good walls," and then left at speed. He said "good walls" to you, as a romantic overture. It was more of an architectural observation that happened to occur in my presence. "Ruth." Nora sat down on the edge of the bed. Her hand found a ribbon-tied scroll on the pillow. She unrolled it, read it. Her eyebrows climbed. "Her hair, a sheaf of well-organized wheat," she read aloud. "Ruth, honey, what is this?" "Poetry. He writes me poetry now." "This is not poetry. This is a literary crime. This is what happens when a wolf gets near a quill and no one intervenes." She read the last line. "My wolf doth think she's rather neat." "Ruth." "I know. You're keeping them." "I know. You have a rock in your pocket." Ruth's hand went involuntarily to her pocket. "How did you keep touching it? You've done it 4 times since I got here. What is it, a talisman? A locket?" "It's a rock, quartz, from the river. It's shiny." "A shiny rock." "He found it and thought I should have it." Nora stared at her sister, her brilliant, composed, intellectually formidable sister, who was currently standing in her chambers defending the romantic merit of a rock, with 6 terrible poems in a drawer and stolen daisies in a water glass, and a look on her face that Nora hadn't seen in 2 years. "You're in love with him again," Nora said. "You absolute disaster." "I never stopped," Ruth said, and the truth of it silenced them both. That's what makes all of this so much worse. I never stopped loving him. I just stopped being able to reach him. And now the wall is gone. And he's right there, Nora. He's right there, and he's bringing me daisies with dirt on them. And he can't say a complete sentence in my presence, and I know that when his memory comes back, the wall comes back too, because the wall was built from grief, and I can't compete with grief. I never could. Hey, Nora caught her hand, squeezed. "Hey, stop!" Ruth stopped. She was breathing harder than she realized. The composure had cracked, not dramatically, but in the specific way that only happened with Nora, the one person she didn't perform for. "Did you tell him?" Nora asked. "About the separation? About how bad it was?" "No." "Ruth, I know. You're letting him court you under false pretenses. You're letting him fall in love with you while holding information that would—" "I know." The words came out sharp, almost angry, and Ruth pressed her hand against her mouth. Then, quieter, "I know what I'm doing. I know it's selfish. I know it's wrong. I also know that this is the first time in 2 years that someone has looked at me, actually looked at me, not through me, not past me, at me. And I can't— Nora, I'm not strong enough to give that up, not yet. I know that makes me a coward." "It makes you human," Nora said, not unkindly. "It also makes you wrong. But I understand the human part." She stayed for a week. Having Nora in the castle meant having a witness, someone who saw everything. Edward's eyes tracking Ruth across rooms, his body angling toward her when she walked past, the tremor in his hands when she was close enough to touch. Someone who also saw the thing underneath, the lie, the guilt, the separation speech in the drawer. Nora watched Edward present Ruth with a pressed flower he'd found between pages of a book in the royal library. She watched Ruth's face, the composure, the softness she couldn't hide, the flash of pain. "He's really trying," Nora said later. "He's a disaster at it, but the trying it's real." "I know. Which makes what you're doing worse." "I know. What happens when he remembers? Not just you, his father, the grief, all the reasons he built the wall in the first place. Then I lose him again. Unless you tell him first. Unless you give him the chance to choose you with full information, all the ugly, all the pain, all the reasons the wall went up, and let him decide." "And if he decides the wall was right? If he remembers his father dying and his mother being destroyed by the bond, and he decides that keeping me at arm's length was the only safe option? Then at least you'll know, and you won't be building a marriage on a lie." Ruth looked away. She knew Nora was right. She'd known from the beginning. Knowing and doing were different countries entirely, separated by a sea of grief and a pocket full of shiny rocks. "Also," Nora added, "he's started a subplot with Lord Ellington, involving a dagger and an arm wrestling rematch, and if you don't intervene soon, there are going to be diplomatic consequences." Chapter 6. The Overheard Truth. The conversation happened on a Thursday evening, and it was never meant to be heard. Ruth didn't know Edward was there. He was supposed to be in the training grounds with Marcus, but he'd finished early, driven by the pull that made him orbit her like a planet that had lost all pretense of having its own trajectory, and was walking toward the solarium when he heard voices. Ruth's voice, and Nora's. Coming through the partly open door of the reading room. He should have announced himself. He should have knocked. He was a king, not a man lurking in his own corridors eavesdropping on his wife. But Ruth was saying something, and the way she was saying it stopped him in his tracks, because he had never, not once, heard Ruth sound like this. Unguarded. Raw. The composure stripped away. "I have to tell him." Her voice was quiet and unsteady, and it didn't sound like his wife at all. It sounded like someone he'd never met, someone who existed underneath the queen. "I have to tell him soon, Nora. I can't keep doing this." "Then tell him." "It's—" A breath. Something caught. His courting, the flowers and the rock and the terrible poetry, and the way he looks at me like I'm— She stopped. When she continued, her voice was thick with something held together by will alone. "It hurts more than the distance did." He felt the words land in his chest like a blade. twisted. The distance was horrible, she continued, but I understood it. I watched his father die, Nora. I watched what the bond did to Helena. And I watched Edward decide, not in words, he never used words, he just did it, that the only way to protect me from that was to stop letting me close enough to be hurt. He was drowning in the crown, and he decided to drown alone rather than risk pulling me under. She knew. She'd understood, the entire time. She'd understood why, and it hadn't helped, because understanding the reason for a wound doesn't make the wound stop bleeding. And I let him, Ruth said, and her voice went flat, with a self-recrimination that made Edward's stomach turn. That's the part I don't tell anyone. He pulled away, and I matched him. Wall for wall. He went formal, I went formal. He stopped reaching, I stopped reaching. I told myself it was dignity. It was pride. I was too proud to fight for my own marriage, Nora. I just let it die. I watched it happen, and I did nothing. You were protecting yourself. I was being a coward. We were both cowards. He was afraid of needing me, and I was afraid of being rejected. And we just circled each other in this enormous castle, sleeping in separate rooms, eating at the same table without speaking, and neither of us ever once said, "This is broken, can we fix it?" Not once. Silence. Edward's back was against the wall. His eyes were burning. And now he wakes up, and he doesn't remember any of it, Ruth whispered. The grief, the walls, the distance, all of it, gone. And he brings me daisies with dirt on the roots. And he spent 3 hours finding a book I mentioned once in passing because he was listening, Nora. He was always listening, even when I thought he wasn't, even when he was drowning. Her voice broke. And now I know. I know that he was always in there, the man who cared, the man who listened, the man who would ransack a library for a book of poetry no one has ever heard of. He was always there, under the grief and the walls and the crown, and we lost 2 years. We wasted 2 years that we can't get back because he was too afraid to need me, and I was too proud to fight for us. The silence after was the loudest thing Edward had ever heard. Tell him, Nora said gently. I'm going to, tomorrow. I'm going to tell him everything. He didn't hear the rest. He was already walking away, his vision blurring, a sound building in his chest that wasn't quite human. The wolf in him went silent. Not the exuberant enthusiasm of courting, not the focused quiet of concentration. A deep, awful stillness. A grief too large for words of any size. And then the memories came. Not all at once, in fragments, like a dam cracking, each fissure letting through a stream of images and sounds and the specific, physical weight of moments lived and lost. His father, in the garden, late afternoon light. Aldrich looking at him with eyes that didn't recognize his own son, and the sound, the terrible, small sound of a king asking his beta who the young man in his study was. His mother, Helena, sitting beside Aldrich's bed in the final weeks, her hand in his, her face a landscape of ruin, the bond carrying every moment of his decline into her body like a wire conducting electricity. She couldn't look away. The bond wouldn't let her. She felt him dying, cell by cell, and she couldn't do anything except be present for it. The funeral, the silence, the weight of the crown on his head, and the decision, not spoken, not examined, barely conscious, that he would not do this to Ruth. He would not let the crown's weight reach her. He would carry it alone, far from her, so that when it crushed him, because it would crush him, it crushed everyone. It had crushed his father. She would be safe. She would be at arm's length. She would survive. And then the other memories. The ones he hadn't understood until right now. A dinner table. Long. Formal. Ruth at the far end in a green dress. She'd done something different with her hair. He hadn't noticed because he was composing a response to the Stone Creek trade proposal in his head while pretending to listen to the ambassador. Her face when she'd walked in and found the seating rearranged. 4 council members added, no warning. And the way her expression hadn't changed. Not a flicker. She'd perfected that by then. He'd taught her to perfect it by never noticing when it did change. The morning he'd realized she wasn't sleeping in their room. Not the first morning, not the second, not the third, the 4th. It had taken him 4 days to notice that his wife's side of the bed was cold, and he'd noticed the way you notice a chair has been moved, a vague sense of difference, investigated and filed without urgency. The last time she'd called him Edward. A Tuesday. She'd been telling him about a discovery in the archives, something about the old territorial treaties, something that excited her. He could see it now, the light in her eyes, the way she leaned forward, the animation in a face that had already started going still around him. And he had listened for approximately 30 seconds before his eyes drifted to the correspondence on his desk, and she had stopped talking mid-sentence, and he had not noticed the silence. She'd said, "Edward, are you listening?" And he'd said, "Of course, my queen," without looking up. She had never called him Edward again. He'd thought he was protecting her. He'd thought distance was safety. He'd thought drowning alone was noble. He had drowned them both. He made it to his quarters, closed the door, slid down it until he was sitting on the floor, his back against the wood, his hands over his face. The wolf, for the first time since it had ever had a voice, spoke in lowercase. "Oh, we did this to her. We thought we were keeping her safe, and we were killing her. We were killing us. We are the thing we were afraid of. We are the crown." He sat there for a long time. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. Morning, unnatural quiet, absence of the usual castle bustle. He didn't come to the solarium the next morning, didn't appear in the corridor, didn't leave a poem. Ruth noticed. She noticed the way you notice the sun not rising, a slow creeping wrongness that something fundamental had shifted. She found out from Anya. "He's been in his quarters since last night," Anya reported, sharp eyes missing nothing about Ruth's reaction. "Marcus says he won't eat. Shifted and ran the North Circuit at 3 a.m. One of the sentries saw him come back and sit in the courtyard in human form for over an hour. In the cold. In March." He knew. She didn't know how, but she knew he knew. The sudden absence, the warm, hovering, gift-bearing orbit gone overnight, was its own communication, a satellite pulled out of alignment by something catastrophic. Where is he now? His study. He asked Marcus to leave. Marcus, in a display of unprecedented insubordination, is sitting outside the door. She went to him. Marcus was in a chair outside the study. He looked up when she approached, and his face held something she'd never seen on it. Fear. Not for himself, for them. "He knows," Marcus said. "How?" "He heard you, last night, you and your sister." The floor tilted. She had been planning to tell him today. On her terms. Composure in place, armor on. Instead, he had heard the raw version. The one she'd given to Nora because Nora was the only person she didn't perform for. He had heard her say it hurts more than the distance. She put her hand on the door. Marcus stood, moved his chair, and walked away without a word. A beta who knew when to leave. She opened the door. He was sitting in the chair behind his desk. Not his usual posture, not the kingly, straight-backed position, the squared shoulders. He was folded forward, elbows on knees, head in hands. He looked smaller than she had ever seen him. When he heard her, he looked up. She had braced for anger, accusation, the cold, familiar distance of the king. What she saw was a man on the other side of a chasm he'd spent 2 years digging, who could finally see how deep it went, and who had just realized that he'd been digging it with both hands, while telling himself he was building a wall to keep her safe. "I remember," he said. His voice was wrecked. All of it. My father, my mother, what the bond did to her. He pressed his hands against his eyes. I remember deciding, not in words, not like a plan. It was more like, after the funeral, after watching what happened to my mother, something in me just closed, like a door. And I told myself it was to protect you. If I kept the weight of the crown away from you, if I carried it alone, then even if it destroyed me, you would be safe. You wouldn't end up like my mother, hollowed out by the bond. He looked at her, and the self-loathing in his eyes was terrible and specific. I thought I was being noble, Ruth. I thought drowning alone was the brave thing to do. I was so convinced I was protecting you that I didn't notice I was abandoning you. 4 days. It took me 4 days to notice you'd left our bed. She stood very still. I remember the green dress, he said. The dinner you planned. You'd done something different with your hair, and I didn't notice because I was composing a trade response in my head. I remember your face when you saw the seating had changed. It didn't change. That's the worst part. Your face didn't change. Because by then you'd learned not to let it. I taught you that. I taught my wife not to show me when I hurt her, because I wasn't paying enough attention to see it anyway. His voice cracked. And I remember the last time you called me Edward. You were telling me about something in the archives. You were excited. You were leaning forward and your eyes were bright, and I looked at my correspondence. You stopped talking, and I didn't notice the silence. She wanted to go to him. She wanted to cross the room and put her hands on his face and tell him it was okay. But it wasn't okay. And making it easy now would mean it was never real. So she stood there and let him feel it. And it was one of the hardest things she had ever done. You said last night that it hurts more than the distance, he said. The courting, the flowers and the rock. Knowing we could have had this the whole time. Yes. I heard what else you said. About yourself. He looked at her steadily. You said you let it die. That you matched me wall for wall. That you were too proud to fight. She hadn't expected him to turn it toward her. She'd expected his guilt to be the whole conversation. But he'd heard all of it, not just his failure. Hers, too. You were right, she said quietly. I was. You pulled away and I let you. I told myself it was dignity. It was pride. You stopped reaching, and I decided that if you didn't care enough to fight for us, I wasn't going to beg. I was going to be the perfect queen, composed, controlled, impeccable. And if you didn't notice I was dying inside, that was your failure, not mine. It was both our failures, he said. The truth of it settled between them like a third person in the room. Both of them, both walls. His built from grief and hers from pride. Two people who loved each other, who had watched their marriage die, and who had each decided, independently and for different reasons, that the other one should be the one to break first. Neither of them had broken. The marriage had broken instead. I can't undo it, he said. 2 years. I can't get them back. And sorry is... It's pathetic, Ruth. It's nothing. But I want you to know, the man who brought you daisies with dirt on the roots wasn't a different person. He was me without the fear. Me before I learned to be afraid of what the bond could do. And I should never, ever have let fear make decisions about our marriage without telling you." She felt the tears on her face before she realized she was crying. Not the dignified single tear kind, the real kind. "You should never have decided what I could handle," she said, and her voice was rough and cracked and not queenly at all. "You watched your mother suffer, and you decided I was too fragile for the same thing. You decided I couldn't carry the weight. You didn't ask me, you just decided. And that's not love, Edward. That's control dressed up as sacrifice." "I know. And I should have fought," she whispered. "I should have banged on the door instead of building a matching wall on my side. I should have said, 'I'm losing you and I'm scared,' instead of, 'The seating arrangements are finalized, Your Majesty.' I was so afraid of being rejected that I chose composure over honesty, and I let us die." "We both chose wrong," he said. "We both chose wrong." The silence after was not comfortable. It was not the warm silence of the corridor or the charged silence of the near miss. It was the silence of two people sitting in the rubble of something they both helped destroy, looking at each other across the debris. He pulled the separation speech from under a stack of papers on his desk. He'd found it. Or she'd left it. She couldn't remember. 7 drafts, he said quietly. I couldn't finish any of them. Because of the second sentence, she nodded. The second sentence was supposed to be why, and the why was that I still loved you. And I couldn't write, I'm leaving you because I love you, because it sounded insane, except it was the truth. He unfolded the draft, found the crossed out line, the one that started with, I still remember the man who, and dissolved into scribbled ink. You didn't finish this sentence. I couldn't. Can you finish it now? She looked at him for a long time. The king, the fool, the poet, the man who had curtsied at her and stolen her a dagger, and built a wall out of grief, and watched her build a matching one and done nothing, and she had done nothing, and they had both done nothing, and the nothing had almost eaten them alive. I still remember the man who tried to bow and shake my hand at the same time, and ended up in something that could only be described as a curtsy, she said. I remember him, and I've been watching him come back for the last 3 weeks, and it has been the most beautiful and the most painful thing I have ever experienced. Because every daisy and every rock and every terrible poem was proof that he was always in there, under the grief, under the crown, under the decision he made without consulting me. And we wasted 2 years, Edward, because you were afraid of what love costs, and I was too proud to tell you I was willing to pay it. He stood up. He didn't cross the room. He just stood there, the desk between them, the speech between them, the truth between them. I want to earn it back, he said. Not in a day, not in a speech. 1 day at a time, the way I lost it. Until the man you remember and the man I am are the same person. Not because the memories are gone, but because I choose to be him, with the grief, with the fear, with all of it. I want to choose you, Ruth, every day, even when the crown is heavy, especially when the crown is heavy. She didn't say yes, she didn't say no. She said, then start. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation. A door opened 1 inch, with the understanding that the rest was up to both of them. Chapter 8. The Earning. A kettle heating, clumsy handling of ceramic. The grovel was not grand. It was not public. It was not a single gesture that resolved everything. It was Tuesday's breakfast. She came down to find a pot of tea already made, with honey. Not by the kitchen staff, by him, personally, based on the singed pot handle and the honey lid that appeared to have been opened with more force than any honey lid in history had required. A king who had probably never operated a kitchen, wrestling with a kettle at dawn. He wasn't there, just the tea. A note. I will get better at this. E. She drank it. It was slightly too sweet. She drank it all. It was Wednesday's silence. She was working in the archives, deep in a translation, when she became aware of him. Not hovering, not orbiting, sitting. At the far table with a stack of documents, reading. The old territorial treaties, the ones she'd been cataloging for 3 years. He had a notebook, careful, detailed notes with questions in the margins. He didn't speak to her, didn't need to. He was there, doing the work of understanding the thing he dismissed, and the message was clear. I am learning what matters to you. I am paying attention to the work you do, not because you need my approval, but because I was a fool not to see it. The silence between them was different from the old silence. The old silence was 2 people pretending the other wasn't there. This silence was 2 people pretending they weren't acutely, painfully, electrically aware of each other's every breath. Different countries of silence entirely. It was Thursday's question. He found Nora in the small courtyard. She looked up at him with an expression that contained approximately 0 warmth and the specific atmospheric pressure of a woman who had heard her sister cry and knew whose fault it was. I want to ask you something, he said. You want to ask about Ruth. Not what she likes. I know what she likes. He paused, choosing his words with a care that surprised her. What was she like before me? Before the crown? Before I taught her to be careful? Nora studied him. The wolf in him was still, not performing, not posturing. Waiting. She was loud, Nora said finally. You wouldn't believe it, but she was loud. She laughed with her whole body. She argued with our father about treaty interpretations at dinner, and she always won, and she didn't apologize for winning. She climbed trees to read because she liked the height. She was a complete nerd and completely herself, and she didn't make herself smaller for anyone. She looked at him steadily. You didn't shrink her. She did that herself. But you created the conditions that made her think she had to. He took it without flinching. Thank you. I'm not finished, Nora stood. She also told you that she let the walls go up, that she matched your distance instead of fighting. And she's right, she did. But don't you dare use her honesty as a shield. She matched your walls because you built the first one. She was reacting to what you did. Don't ever make the mistake of thinking her part in this absolves you of yours. I won't. Good. She paused. Also, the poetry. It's truly terrible. You should know that. I've been told. Keep writing it. She cries over every one. That night, Ruth found a note on her pillow. Not a poem, just a line in his handwriting. I would very much like to hear you argue about treaty interpretations at dinner. I will not be reading correspondence. I will be listening. E. She held the note for a long time, longer than a queen should hold a piece of paper. Long enough that the analytical part of her mind gave up trying to categorize what she was feeling and simply filed it under everything, all of it, at once. It was Friday's absence. He stopped writing poetry. She reached for her pillow that night and found nothing, no scroll, no ribbon. The space where the poem should have been was empty. She understood. The poems belonged to the courtship that was built on incomplete truth. He was dismantling it. Not because he didn't feel those things, because the foundation they stood on had cracked, and he refused to build on broken ground. The absence of the terrible poems hurt more than the absence of the black orchids ever had. Assessment. Subject has removed a positive stimulus, and the resulting emotional response is disproportionately intense. This suggests the stimulus held value beyond its objective literary merit, which was negligible. We miss the poems. We miss being the person someone writes terrible poems for. We miss being told our hair resembles well-organized wheat. This is not a rational response. We do not care that it is not rational. We miss it. We miss it. We miss it. It was Saturday's surrender. She couldn't sleep. She went walking through the castle at 2 in the morning, wrapped in a blanket, and she passed her own door from the outside corridor and stopped. He was there, sitting on the stone floor, back against the wall, blanket around his shoulders, eyes open, not sleeping, not guarding, just there. "You're not guarding me," she said. "No, I just can't be far. And I can't presume to be close. So this is the distance I have." She looked at him. The Alpha King, on a stone floor outside his wife's door at 2 in the morning because the need to be near her and the knowledge that he hadn't earned the right to be were pulling him in exactly 2 directions, and this hallway was the midpoint. His body was doing something his conscious mind didn't know about. His chin was slightly lowered, his throat angled toward her, an involuntary tilt of submission that an alpha's body should never make. Not political submission, the other kind. The kind that said, "I am yours. I am sorry. I don't know how to be anything other than yours. And I am sorry for every moment I forgot." Ruth, who had studied wolf behavior for 15 years, who had read every record of mate bonds in the archives, recognized what his body was saying. Recognized it and felt something she'd been holding shut with both hands crack open. She sat down next to him, on the cold stone floor, in the dark corridor, at 2 in the morning. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. She leaned her head against the wall, and after a moment, he leaned his against it too. And they sat there, side by side, not touching, not speaking. 2 people who had both helped break something, sitting in the same hallway, choosing not to be apart even though they hadn't yet figured out how to be together. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Assessment. We are sitting on a floor. We are a queen. We are sitting on a stone floor at 2 in the morning next to a man who wrote us poems about wheat and stole us a dagger and then broke our heart and then sat outside our door because he couldn't be far. We have been in this situation for approximately 4 minutes, and we do not intend to move. The file on this situation is now 3 files. We may need a cabinet. The howl fell on the first clear night after the new moon. They walked to the mountain together, not hand in hand, not yet, but together, side by side. The pack streaming behind them, torches flickering against the dark trees. Ruth could feel Edward's tension, a tightness in his shoulders, a controlled precision that she recognized as fear held on a very short leash. "The pack bond," she said quietly as they climbed. "Can you feel it?" He shook his head. Fragments, static. Marcus is clear, a few of the older wolves, but the whole, the network, it's like hearing a conversation through a wall. She'd suspected. The mate bond and the pack bond were not the same thing, but in an Alpha King, they ran through the same foundation. His connection to his people was routed through his connection to his mate. When the marriage had hollowed out, the bond had hollowed too, slowly, imperceptibly, so gradually he hadn't noticed what he was losing. The amnesia hadn't caused the disconnection, the neglect had, both of theirs. The amnesia had just made it visible. "What if I can't do it?" he asked, and the admission cost him. "Then we deal with it, together." He looked at her. In the torchlight, his eyes held both, the gold of the wolf and the blue of the man. Not separate, not competing, both present. They reached the peak. The pack assembled in a wide crescent beneath the full moon. The sky was obscenely clear, stars scattered like salt across black water. Edward stepped to the edge, closed his eyes, reached. Static. Fragments. The broken signal of a bond he'd let atrophy through years of emotional neglect. Compounded by the scrambled pathways of a recovering brain. He couldn't find the full web, the living network of every wolf in his pack, their fears, their trust, all routed through him, was dark. He started the howl anyway. His voice rose alone, a single note, clear and strong and also, unmistakably, lonely. The sound of an alpha reaching for his pack and finding silence. It was the most honest sound he had ever made. And then Ruth stepped forward. She took his hand, her fingers laced through his, warm and steady, and she added her voice. Not a queen performing a ceremony, not a political partner, a mate, choosing, with full knowledge, with all the pain, with all the ugly, complicated truth, to stand with him anyway. The mate bond flared, not the hollow thing it had been, the real one, scarred and fragile and rebuilt on honesty instead of pretense, on rubble instead of marble, stronger in the broken places because they'd both had to choose it instead of inheriting it. Through that bond, through her, the pack bond flooded back. Not perfectly, not the clean, powerful signal of a fully bonded alpha. Raw, rough-edged, alive. He could feel them. Marcus steady and reliable, Anya fierce. The sentries, the families, the elders, the pups, small, bright sparks of uncomplicated trust. The howl swelled, voice after voice joining. It was not polished. It was rougher, messier, more honest. It was enough. Walking down the mountain afterward, hands still intertwined, the pack trailing behind them in the exhausted, comfortable silence that follows a howl, Edward started to say something. Ruth squeezed his hand. Not tonight. Tonight was enough. They walked in silence, and for the first time since his memory returned, it was the good kind, the kind that didn't need filling. Behind them, Nora nudged Anya. Took them long enough. Anya glanced at the king and queen, silhouettes against the moonlit trail, shoulders nearly touching. She's going to make him work for it, Anya said, with a satisfaction that bordered on professional. Good. Oh, he'll work for it, Nora agreed. She's got a rock in her pocket and 7 terrible poems in a drawer. He never stood a chance. 7? I thought it was 6. He wrote one more before he stopped. She found it this morning. It rhymed sorry with story and used the word profoundly 3 times. It was the worst thing I have ever read. She put it with the others. Of course she did. Of course she did. She found it at breakfast the next morning. Not a poem, not a scroll tied with ribbon. A single daisy in a tiny clay pot, freshly planted, dirt still under the edges where someone had been working with hands that governed a kingdom, but apparently still couldn't operate a watering can without getting soil on the table. No note, no grand gesture, just a daisy, alive and growing, and a king sitting at the other end of the table, watching her with a face that held everything, the nervousness and the hope, and the grief and the love, and the knowledge of what they'd both done, and the steady, quiet determination to do better. He'd written one word on the pot, in his own handwriting, slightly smudged. Ruth. Not my queen, not your majesty. Ruth. She picked up the daisy. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at him. She reached into her pocket and set the quartz rock on the table next to the pot. She'd kept it, through everything, through the courtship and the truth and the reckoning and the silence and the cold stone floor at 2 a.m. She'd kept the shiny rock a man who couldn't remember her name had given her because he thought she should have it. Something in him, the part that had been quiet for days, grieving in the only way it knew how, stirred. Not a shout, not all caps, a whisper. She kept the rock. Ruth picked up her tea, already made, honey. Slightly too sweet, in exactly the way it had been every morning for a week, because a king who could negotiate treaties with 3 rival packs simultaneously could not, it seemed, master the honey-to-tea ratio. And she found this so specifically, so precisely, so devastatingly endearing that she would drink slightly too sweet tea for the rest of her life and never once correct him. The Stone Creek Treaty Translation is at a critical juncture, she said, her voice calm and precise and warm. I could use a second pair of eyes, if you're not too busy with matters of state. An invitation. A door opened another inch. He stood from his end of the table and walked to hers. He pulled out the chair next to her. He sat down, not across from her, next to her. The distance between Your Majesty and Ruth closed in 4 steps across a breakfast table. Show me, he said. She opened the manuscript. He leaned in to read. Their shoulders touched. Neither of them moved away. Outside, the morning sun caught the glimmer moss on the old castle walls, and it pulsed once, faintly, with a warm and quiet light. Final assessment? The Alpha is sitting next to us. He is reading a 300-year-old treaty and asking questions that suggest he has done the preparatory reading, which means he has been studying in the archives when we weren't there, which means he has been learning the thing we love in the spaces we weren't watching, which is the most... Filing suspended. Reason? We are not crying at a breakfast table. We are a queen. Queens do not cry at breakfast tables over slightly too sweet tea and a clay pot with their name on it. We are not crying. The moisture on our face is condensation from the tea. The tea is very hot. That is the official position of this office, and we are not taking further questions. Also, his shoulder is warm. Also, we are keeping the rock forever.